I'm Adélie Pojzman-Pontay, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as Russia continues to target civilians, dropping a bomb on a shopping centre or using their tried and tested double-tap technique, NATO members admit to being taken by surprise by Trump's announcements that they would have to buy Patriot missile systems for Ukraine. Meanwhile, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz comes to the UK to discuss defence, and Ukraine names Yulia Svyrydenko its new prime minister. Finally, our colleague Danielle Sheridan interviews former head of the British Army General Sir Patrick Saunders.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Thursday, the 17th of July. 3 years and 145 days since the full-scale invasion began. I'm on my own today, so let me start with the military updates. In terms of frontline advances, we're going to go from north to south, around the clock like we usually do. So starting north of Sumy near Sudzha, Russian troops advance towards the village of Kindrativka, past the village of Oleksivka, and towards the liberated Andriivka. Continuing east, advances further south of Vodolahi and in two parallel pushes between the villages of Yablunivka and Yunakivka. And then there's a finger further to the east, just past the border and towards the village of Oleksandria. In the east, towards Kupiansk, there are also some movements. The Russian troops advanced near the village of Ambrana. The 45th Engineered Battalion pushes north of Krasny Pershe going west, and the 9th Guards Artillery Brigade is advancing towards Krasny Pershe from the south. There's also a push towards Dovenke from the southeast, and 12 kilometers to the south, there are two parallel pushes towards Kindrashivka and past Radkivka. If we continue south, alongside the front line, there are two pushes in opposite directions from the 5th Guards Motor Rifle Regiment, one to the north towards Kolesnikivka and another to the south towards Zarizove. Continuing south, there are pushes towards Hrakivka, Ritkodub, towards Karpivka, past Zelena Dolina to the south and past Yampolivka. Then there are three distinct pushes near Chasiv Yar, one north past Rehohivka and two in Chasiv Yar itself. Continuing south, there are 5 pushes around Donetsk, one towards the village of Delivka, and then continuing south past Krymska and Toretsk itself, and down past Leonidivka. The front line then moves west and slightly north. It's more or less horizontal. It's not really horizontal. It's more like a bulge instead of continuing to curve south. And there are 4 pushes in this sort of bulge around Yablunivka, Oleksandro-Kalinove, one further west and pushing north towards Popivya, and towards the west towards the village of Novotoretske, past Rizine, and also towards Novoekonomishne. As the front line curves back down from the bulge towards the south around Pokrovsk, the Russian forces continue to push 2.5 kilometers northeast of Sevchenko, and then continuing west, the 15th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade pushes from the east towards Urachne, and another push comes from the west in a 1.2 kilometer long finger to the west side of the settlement. Continuing south, alongside the front line, there are pushes north of Kutyarivka and from the east towards Horikove. And then in a straight line going south, there are several pushes. It starts at the northern tip with the village of Novokatske and continues for a little over 26 kilometers down to Zelenepole. And there are neat advances there in Zelenepole and past Mene. And then finally, much further south, around Zaporizhia, so at the bottom of our clock towards 6 o'clock, there are some pushes coming from the south going north towards the villages of Kamyanska and around the village of Stepove. Now, for the strikes on Ukraine overnight, The Ukrainian Air Force reported that Russian forces have launched one Iskander-M ballistic missile from occupied Crimea and 400 Shahed-type and decoy drones from the directions of Bryansk and Kursk cities, Shatalovo in Smolensk Oblast, Primorsko-Akhtarsk in Krasnodar Krai, Milerovo in Rostov Oblast, and occupied Kapy-Chowda in Crimea on the night of July 15th and July 16th. The Ukrainian forces have downed 198 Shahed-type drones, and that 145 decoy drones were lost or suppressed through electronic warfare. And the strike package largely targeted Kryvyi Rih, Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, Kharkiv Oblast, Vinnytsia City in Vinnytsia Oblast. Now, then there is another news of a ballistic missile, but it hasn't been confirmed. So it's unclear whether there has been one or two ballistic missile hits overnight. The Dnipropetrovsk Oblast officials and Ukraine's Southern Operational Command reported that Russian forces launched another Iskander-M ballistic missile against both Kryvyi Rih and Odessa Oblast. But the Ukrainian Air Force, however, have reported only one overnight. And the Odessa Oblast officials did not report a ballistic missile strike in the Oblast, so it's unclear whether there have been, as I said, one or two ballistic missiles overnight. Then Russia drops a 500-kilogram bomb on a shopping center in Donetsk Oblast, killing 2 and injuring 28. It was an aerial bomb, and that was reported by regional officials. Then there was a double-tap attack in Nikopol, which injured 5, including some emergency workers. A Russian NFPV drone struck a cargo truck, which caused a fire and injured 2 civilians. And then as the emergency workers were working on site, there was another drone which targeted the scene, injuring 3 emergency workers. Other point of news, there was a missing Russian Mi-8 helicopter that was found crashed in the Far East, and all 5 on board were found dead. It was operated by the airline Vzlyot, and it disappeared 3 days ago on July 14th during a flight from the remote settlement of Okhotsk to the city of Magadan, so that is like on the very far east of Russia, and that was reported by the state news agency TASS. And then we reported on this podcast that a Ukrainian security service colonel in Kyiv was killed, and the killing was claimed by a US-founded extremist group. In a statement, the local affiliate, known as White Phoenix, praised its comrades for the July 10th killing of the colonel. And sources in the counterterrorism field consider the group's claim credible. That was reported in The Guardian. In other defense news, the Ukraine parliament backs nearly a 10 billion defense budget increase in the first reading. Ukraine's parliament had approved a 9.8 billion increase in defense in the first reading that was announced by Ukraine's finance ministry in a press release yesterday. And then finally, continuing to follow up on the story unfolding since the beginning of the week, where Donald Trump announced he would impose severe secondary tariffs if the war didn't end in the next 50 days, and calling Putin to come to the table for a ceasefire. Russian reactions are still coming through. Peskov said at a press briefing on July 16th that, I quote, "Many statements have been made, many words of disappointment have been spoken, but we want to hope that pressure is being exerted on the Ukrainian side." So they're hoping that the West pressures Ukraine into a ceasefire. Peskov continued, "It now appears that the Ukrainian side perceives all words of support not as a signal for peace, but as a signal for the continuation of war." Peskov continued, claiming that Europeans maintain a rabid militaristic attitude towards Moscow. That is it for the military updates of the day. I'm going to carry on with what's been going on in politics. So, continuing to follow up on the news of the week on the Patriot missiles and their potential delivery to Ukraine, Trump said a couple of days ago, actually, on July 15th, asked by a journalist on Base Andrews, Maryland, when he thought the first Patriot missiles were going to be bought by allies, Trump responded that they were already being shipped. The journalist then said from what countries, and then Trump mostly talked about Germany, and he added, "We're always getting our money back in full." Now, in a story from Reuters, there were many quotes from diplomats and officials across Europe saying that they were neither briefed nor consulted ahead of the announcement that NATO partners and EU member states, for a lot of them, would buy these Patriot missiles on behalf of Ukraine. So in Reuters on Tuesday, during the Oval Office meeting, Rutte mentioned 6 NATO countries. That's Finland, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, the Netherlands and Canada. That one's not an EU country, obviously, that were willing to participate in the weapons purchasing scheme. And then high-ranking sources at 2 of those countries' embassies in the US told Reuters they personally learned of the plan as it was announced. And even close allies to the US appeared to learn of the proposal in real time. One separate European ambassador said, "It is my clear sense that nobody has been briefed about the exact details in advance. I also suspect that internally in the administration, they are only now beginning to sort out what it means in practice." And then the Ukrainian outlet Suspilny reported that an unnamed NATO representative said that the NATO security assistance and training for Ukraine fund will coordinate the NATO purchases of US weapons for Ukraine. We'll obviously continue to report on the delivery of Patriot missiles as everything unfolds. Today, some big bilateral UK news as the Chancellor for Germany, Friedrich Merz, is joining his counterpart Keir Starmer in a visit to the UK. So last week, we had the French president. Today, it is the German Chancellor. It will be the biggest UK-German treaty since 1945, and the visit will be very much focused on defence, just like the visit with Macron was very much on defence. Starmer and Merz don't really come from the same politics tradition. Starmer centre-left, Merz is very much a conservative, but they have had a shared ambition to provide leadership on Europe's defence. Merz, as it has been talked about in this podcast many times before, is a lot more hawkish than his predecessor, Olaf Scholz. And so it's bringing the UK and Germany into closer alignment on Ukraine. A German government official, granted anonymity to speak candidly like others, described the relationship between the two leaders as excellent. The pact has a security cooperation at its heart, just like the French visit last week, including the development of a new long-range missile system and mutual assistance pledge, spelling out that a threat to one country would be seen as a threat to another. It's also a chance to discuss the announcements of the weapons drive for Ukraine and figuring out the nitty-gritty, the details, who pays for what, in which framework, with whatever mechanisms, which, as we've just talked about, no one really knows much about at this stage. It's also a chance to reinforce what has been nicknamed the Triangle Alliance. So that is the alliance between Starmer, Macron and Merz in Germany. Germany has been more keen to involve the UK into any defence deal, any defence treaty or alliance with the EU. France has been a bit more lukewarm. And apparently Merz has said on the trip to Kyiv to Starmer, if you want to get to Germany, you have to get past France. So we'll continue to look at how these love triangle, is it a love triangle, relationships are going. And then following up on yesterday's story about a new prime minister and government in Ukraine, Yulia Svyrydenko was appointed as prime minister for Ukraine. She is the 19th prime minister. She was backed today in parliament by 262 members. So a little bit of background on Yulia Svyrydenko. She's 39 years old. She will be the second woman in the history of independent Ukraine to leave the government after Yulia Tymoshenko. A bit of background on her. In 2011, she was appointed the head of Chernihiv's permanent trade mission in Wuxi, China. She speaks Chinese and she's worked very hard to attract Chinese investment into Ukraine. One of these results has been the establishment of Ekovtor, a Chernihiv-based company backed by 100% foreign capital. Then she entered public service in 2015 as an advisor to the head of the Chernihiv Regional State Administration, where she's from. And she then became the head of the Regional Department of Economic Development before being promoted to first deputy governor and becoming the region's top official as a result. She apparently had a lot of success driving foreign direct investments in her hometown and region of Chernihiv, attracting more than $340 million. That's roughly 80% of the total $430 million the region received at the time in terms of investment. And in 2017, Chernihiv ranked the first among all Ukrainian regions for investment growth. She joined Ukraine's Ministry of Economy in 2019 as a deputy minister and then became first deputy minister in 2020, where she oversaw labour, employment, industry and pricing policy, before being appointed deputy head to the office of the president, where she managed economic policy and investor relations. And on April 30, which is the latest news before she became prime minister, she was the person negotiating and signing the mineral resources deal with the Americans in Washington. One Ukrainian source, Mykola Davidyuk, believes that her promotion, he's a political scientist, by the way, believes that her promotion is a further sign of the need for effective cooperation with the United States. It's worth noting as well that in 2023, Time, the American magazine, included Yulia Svyrydenko, who was then first deputy prime minister, in its 100 Next list, which highlights the next generation of leaders from around the world. And then the US Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo, had written about her: with such young, intelligent and determined leaders at the helm of the country, Ukraine's post-war future looks brighter than ever. So she's been very much a favourite of Zelensky, as we've just highlighted, growing very, very much in the last 10 to 12 years. Slight dimple in all of that. While she's always focused her support programs for Ukrainian businesses, there was a scandal last week that gave a hint that she might be very loyal to the president and to the government and maybe lacking independence. There was a call for applications to appoint a new director of the Bureau of Economic Security, a highly strategic position created in 2021. That person in that position would be responsible for investigating economic crimes and is closely monitored by the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. The appointment is meant to come before the end of July and is one of the conditions set by the EU and the IMF for continued financial aid payments. It was a lengthy process, and the candidacy that was selected by the jury was of a man called Alexander. The jury was made of 3 government members and 3 foreign experts. But the government, including Yulia Svyrydenko, voted against this appointment, citing risks to the country's security because Alexander Zvivinsky's father lives in Russia. And there are several experts in Ukraine that believe the candidacy was rejected because he's very highly qualified as an anti-corruption investigator. So considering how much anti-corruption has been one of the fighting lines of Zelensky domestically, it'll be very interesting to keep an eye on that in the following months. And then finally, Ukraine appoints a new special envoy to the US, Ola Stefanishina. She's a seasoned diplomat and an expert in European and Euro-Atlantic integration. And she's held top government roles since 2020. In Friday's episode of our sister podcast Battle Lines, which focuses on wider global affairs, our defence editor Danielle Sheridan interviewed the former head of the British Army, General Sir Patrick Sanders. Given his candour, we wanted to play you an excerpt relevant to the Ukrainian and European theatres. For context, General Sanders stood down as the head of the British Army last summer and had been tipped to be the next Chief of Defence Staff, but fell out of favour with the government for being too outspoken about the extent of troop cuts. Danielle spoke to him in the garden of his home in rural Wiltshire with his blonde Labrador Fargo by his side. It was Danielle's last story before being sent on her next big assignment, maternity leave. Danielle, we wish you all the best. You can listen to the full version of the interview, which includes reflection on the Middle Eastern theatre, in Battle Lines.
We've been very lucky because we've lived in a period of time, 30 years or so, where the threats to our, to the UK, but also to our critical national infrastructure has been much lower. Mm-hmm. So when I when I joined, the threat was a combination of threats from the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, and then, of course, the threat of terrorism from the IRA. We had much better security systems, much better protection in those days during the Cold War than we do now. The world has now become as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than it was in the Cold War. I always worry about the layers of security we have, but I worry much more about our resilience, our ability to recover from things, to recover from strikes, to protect our civil population, to make sure that the population understand that these are no longer things that might happen elsewhere. They could happen in the UK.
This whole of society approach.
Yeah. If you take Finland as an example.
Yeah.
Finland has got bomb shelters for 4.5 million people. You can survive as a government and as a society under direct missile and air attack from Russia. We don't have that.
Was that ever a conversation when you were in the army that we should have bomb shelters?
Yeah, it was always a conversation that we should make sure that our, the particularly critical parts of our military infrastructure should be much better protected than they were. But we should think hard about creating sort of underground command and control centres. The peace dividend has put us in this position, and we've now got to wake up and realise that that world is gone.
There were conversations about developing underground command and control centres, but they were never actually realised.
No, it always came down to a combination of it being too costly and not a high enough priority, and the threat didn't feel sufficiently imminent or serious to make it worth it.
There's war in the Middle East. There's war between Russia and Ukraine. What more needs to happen for the threat to feel imminent? Does Russia need to invade another country in Europe for it to be taken seriously?
I don't know what more signals we need for us to realise that if we don't act now and we don't act the next 5 years to increase our resilience, I don't know what more is needed.
Can you give me a couple more examples of what increasing resilience would look like? Maybe the Finnish approach to having bomb shelters and a command and control underground centre. Like, what are some tangible examples that a reader could set up and think, oh shit, this is serious stuff we're talking about?
Well, it ranges from everything from, the undersea cables that are, that we know Russia are targeting and trying to cut, which would cut us off. Temporarily, it would have an impact on, everything. Your internet would stop working, your payment systems would stop working, capital would be lost. Take the countries that are very alive to the threat.
Estonia,
Poland, the Nordics. Governments there take a really proactive, serious approach to making sure that the population realise that they could be attacked at almost any time. And so they give them a set of instructions on how to prepare for the consequences of that: loss of power, loss of fuel, storing food. They encourage them to have their own sort of defensive bunkers, whether that's in cellars or civil defence. They encourage people to volunteer for sort of civil defence roles to protect key bits of infrastructure.
Do you have your own defensive bunker here?
No.
Okay. Because, people kind of take the piss out of people like that in the UK.
Preppers.
Yeah. But are they actually the right ones? Like, if Russia invades, are they going to be laughing at us and saying, you should have had all your canned goods and Molotov cocktails and whatnot at the ready? I mean, I'm kind of making light of it, but genuinely, is there an argument to be a prepper?
There's certainly an argument for being prepared for a loss of some or all of the essential services that we rely on, whether that is as a result of a weather event, whether it's a result of a collapse of national infrastructure. So Spain is a good example where, Spain lost access to power for 24 hours or so. Now, we don't know whether that was just a malfunction in the system or whether it was a cyber attack. So I think much greater preparedness is something that we should all take some personal responsibility for, and not simply assume that the government will provide these things for us. Medical supplies, making sure that you can look after yourself, all of these things are sensible, precautionary things to do. But the whole thing starts with a conversation about realising that these are things that could happen, and they could happen either through natural disasters or they could happen through actual hostile attacks, whether that's direct attacks from missiles or whether it's what we might describe as grey zone or hybrid attacks that just insidiously undermine our lifestyle and what we've become used to. And that conversation has to be led by government and picked up by, papers like yours, just to raise people's awareness. Because at the moment, one of the reasons that democratic governments don't respond to this threat is these are not the things that get them elected. If you look in most of the polling in this country, most people would say that they think that more should be spent on defence and on national security and resilience. But when you ask them what their priorities for government spending are, defence comes close to the bottom of the list. Mm-hmm. When they realise that this means that we might need to either raise taxes or reprioritise spending away from welfare, from social care, from education, whatever it is, they don't like that. Mm. We have to have a more serious conversation as a country to realise that defence is no longer discretionary. And if we can't borrow more, and I don't think we can as a country, then you have to find the money for it. And that either means reprioritising and accepting that's what the government will do, or it means raising taxes. If Russia stops fighting in Ukraine, you get to a position where within a matter of months, they will have the capability to conduct a limited attack on a NATO member that we will be responsible for supporting.
Do you think...
And that happens by 2030.
That an attack on a NATO country could happen by 2030?
So you can look at almost any intelligence assessments from our NATO partners and they're all saying the same thing. Within 2 to 5 years, Russia will be ready to mount an attack against NATO or a NATO country.
Do you believe that will happen?
If you want to know what Putin is going to do, you should just listen to what he says and to what he writes. This is Putin's 5th war. Every time he's given the option of choosing peace, he chooses war as an instrument of policy. And he's created mindset in Russia where Russians think that they are under threat and under attack from the West. And he's talked frequently about restoring historical Russian lands.
Yes.
Those historical lands that he means are now NATO states who enjoy an Article 5 guarantee. There's a scenario where either the US are distracted, possibly by a confrontation in the Indo-Pacific with China, where they've reprioritized, where NATO hasn't rearmed itself at the speed it needs to, hasn't got strong enough to prevent these sort of attacks. And Putin, who is an opportunist, seizes the opportunity to take some limited objectives, perhaps claiming that there's a Russian majority on that piece of terrain, that he's going to liberate from a Nazi regime. We've heard this story before, haven't we? And he invades and then sits back, not having gone very far, just enough to have caused Article 5 to need to be triggered, and sits back behind an umbrella of tactical or strategic nuclear weapons and says, what are you going to do?
And what will we do?
Well, I would hope that Article 5 will be triggered and that we would restore that territory, because our collective security guarantee is what keeps us safe. The UK is safe because it will not fight alone. We cannot fight alone. The UK is safe because it's part of NATO. That's why Putin wants to get rid of NATO, and this becomes the mechanism by which he'd do it.
So do you think genuinely that we could be at war by 2030?
I think it's a realistic possibility.
Mm. And this whole, coalition of the willing, I think I was in Romania visiting troops earlier this year when Kiev said, I will put boots on the ground in Ukraine. That's gone all quiet. I don't know what the coalition of the willing are up to. We don't hear about it anymore. Is there actually likelihood that British troops are going to be going into Ukraine anytime soon?
Well, I think they should. And I've been saying this for 2 years, 3 years. I was saying it when I was CGS, that what we should be doing in Ukraine is helping the Ukrainians train themselves and equip. So what we've been doing very effectively is training Ukrainians in the UK.
Yes.
But that takes those Ukrainians out of Ukraine, those soldiers out of Ukraine for quite long periods of time. It means they're not available. And we're training them at quite a basic level. It's about 5 or 6 weeks of training.
Yeah.
And then they find themselves going onto the front line with 5 or 6 weeks of training. Now, that's more than the Russians are getting, but we owe it to those soldiers to give them much better training. So if you think about our experience in the Second World War, no one who went ashore on D-Day or afterwards had anything less than 22 weeks of training.
Wow.
So they're not getting enough training. And if you want to train, provide them with that level of and degree of training and support that, and you want to get them up to training at higher levels of echelon, so battalions and brigades, then you've got to do that in Ukraine, and we should be there helping them. So we should have done that by now, and we've held back from doing it.
Why? Why have we held back?
I think a concern that it would be seen as escalatory, that it would put British soldiers at risk. Those things are true. I don't think it would be escalatory, but I think it would certainly increase the risk to our soldiers. But we're already at risk. We've already become a party to this conflict. We're already supplying weapons. And if our future security is bound up in making sure that Russia is defeated in Ukraine, and they can be, they absolutely can be defeated. And defeat doesn't mean restoring all of the lands that they've taken. Defeat means denying Putin his objectives. So if you can end up with a situation where Ukraine remains a sovereign and independent country that can align itself to Western allies in the way that it clearly wants to do, that has security guarantees from the West, that has Western troops based in it, and where NATO remains strong and Russia is having to defend a 600-mile border and reconstruct all the devastation that it's caused in eastern Ukraine, that's not a win for Putin. That's a defeat. And we can get there next year.
Why next year?
Because next year, that's the point where a number of pressures begin to really count. Putin is fighting at the moment, partly because his generals are lying to him. He doesn't understand how badly this war is going for him. And, they've stopped talking about casualty figures now in Russia, but it is over 1 million. I mean, just think about that. 1 million casualties. And what have they achieved? Almost nothing. So he faces a reckoning if a number of things happen. First of all, the war goes on. Secondly, the economy really begins to feel the pinch, and it will begin to feel the pinch. Thirdly, he's forced into a new round of mobilization. And fourthly, Ukraine gets more and more adept and skillful at attacking infrastructure and bringing the war home into Russia. All of those things suddenly cause Putin to realize that he can't achieve his objectives, and he's going to have to find some way of accepting a ceasefire. And a ceasefire on the terms that I described is a loss. It's a defeat for Putin.
So he won't capitulate, will he? Why would he accept? And next year, though, why would he accept that?
Because the political costs become really intense for him. Otherwise, it's an endless war.
But Trump described him the other day as a gentleman. If the person who is the most powerful leader in the world is describing a dictator as a gentleman, how is there any hope that this will be solved?
Trump says a lot of things, and he often says a lot of contradictory things in the same sentence or the same speech. So we should never focus in on one thing that Trump has said. You can bring this war to a really rapid close if between the US and Europe, we really lean in to rearming Ukraine and to supporting them and doing more than we can. But if the US doesn't do that, if they don't extend the material support, the military support that they provided beyond what President Biden authorized, that runs out this summer, then as long as they don't turn off the targeting, they don't turn off the intelligence, they don't prevent other countries from buying US equipment and giving it to the Ukrainians, then actually Ukraine can still survive.
But surviving and winning are different things.
No, but winning for Ukraine is surviving.
Okay.
So I would love to say that the Ukrainians will be able to rearm and then conduct an offensive that restores all of the territory that Russia has taken. That may be the point at some point in the future, but it's not the case now. But surviving as an independent sovereign state, which leans to the West, that's a win for Ukraine. None of us would have wanted this to happen, but it's definitely a loss for Russia.
Do you see this happening, though? Do you see a win for Ukraine actually happening before 2030, when Putin's rearmed and invaded another country?
So those two things are slightly different. I think that as long as Russia is involved in fighting Ukraine on the scale it is at the moment, it would find it difficult to then, and foolish, to take on NATO as well. So I think the precondition for Russian aggression of the sort we were talking about, territorial aggression, is stopping the fighting in Ukraine. That allows him to rebuild his army. Don't forget his air force and navy. Well, his navy's been attacked in the Black Sea, but he's still got plenty of other navy ships, and he's still got most of his air force. So he's got a lot of capability, and of course his nuclear weapons as well.
Not to mention his lack of regard for life, so he doesn't care how many men he gets through.
No, but that begins to count. I mean, don't forget that Afghanistan, the Russians only took 15,000 casualties in Afghanistan, and that really did begin to count at the end of the Soviet Union. So there are limits, even with Russia. You know, this idea that Russia never loses, that Russia never gives up, it's historically inaccurate. It does. There are countless occasions in history where Russian leaders have worked out that the cost, it's too high a price to pay. Putin's not there yet at the moment because we're not sending strong enough signals to say that we will continue to support Ukraine, whatever.
Yeah.
If we do that, then he will get to that point. It becomes a mutually hurting stalemate.
But as you say, that's a political decision, you know, that's for the PM to stand up and say.
I mean, we should be proud. We should be really proud of what the UK has done. I'm not going to criticise this government or the previous government for the support that they've given to Ukraine.
Yeah.
You know, it's been really, we've been at the leading edge of this, but we can't take our eye off it, and we probably need to do more.
And more being
more material support, more being, you know, the initiative you were talking about, you know, the Coalition of the Willing, which incidentally, I think the Coalition of the Willing is something that gets deployed after there has been some form of framework or ceasefire. What I'd say is we should be there now training.
We should be in country training.
We should be in Western Ukraine helping the Ukrainians with their training and their equipping.
What is the biggest threat to Britain's security?
Russia.
Russia remains the biggest threat. Which country do you see most likely on Putin's hit list then?
So I think we are close to being public enemy number one.
Really?
Because it was the UK that really galvanised the international community's response in the early days of the Ukraine war. There were plenty of countries who didn't quite know how to respond and were probably thinking back to the playbook of all the stuff that we hadn't done when Russia invaded Crimea and first invaded eastern Ukraine. And I'm really proud that actually our political leaders and the government drew a line, said, no, this is unacceptable. There's a long history of mistrust and animosity between the UK and Russia. We're not the most powerful opponent that they would say they face, because we are good at setting an example, because we're good at galvanizing international opinion, because we are good at diplomacy, we're good at convening, then we punch well above our weight on things, on issues like this, and it's right that we do.
That's really interesting. I genuinely thought you were going to say somewhere closer to home, like Estonia or Lithuania.
No, I think that, so the territorial threat is definitely going to be one of, I mean, you can point to sort of 4 likely targets that Russia would go for. You know, I don't think we're going to face a huge broad front advance where the Russians are heading for Berlin. You know, I don't think that plays through. But I do think, because of what I described, you know, a chance to seize limited objectives, to restore parts of what they would say is historical Russia, and to break NATO, then there are 4 areas. You know, working your way down from the high north, there's the island of Svalbard. Svalbard matters enormously because of its physical location. It's in a really important geostrategic location. You know, it sits at a point where Russia would want to guarantee access into the North Atlantic, would not want the UK and NATO to be able to constrain those approaches in and out of the Kola Peninsula. It's where its nuclear bastion is. So Svalbard matters geographically, but also because it has a status where it can't be militarized, and where Russians have already got a footprint there, and they're allowed to extract mineral rights. You can see that they might start to play tunes with this grey zone incursions and test NATO that way. So Svalbard is one. I think as you come further south, the next obvious are the 3 Baltic states. And if I pointed to one of them, I'd say Estonia and the town of Narva. We have a British battle group that is committed, that is part of the National Defence Plan, and a brigade that would get there very quickly if we got it right and had the warnings to reinforce that. So you will see British troops involved from day one of that. So we're committed. Then you have some of the islands in the Baltic, which I think Russia wouldn't do on its own, but might do is combine something else, because the moment you can hold some of these islands, and they're Danish islands like Bornholm, they're Swedish islands like Golan, Faroese, Estonian islands, That then closes down the Baltic to NATO once they've got those. And then there's Suwałki. So that's that 60-mile wide or 60-kilometer strip of land between Belarus and the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad. And if they took that, they would be able to have a link up from Kaliningrad into Belarus, which is pro-Russian. And it would completely isolate, it would cut all of the land borders from the 3 Baltic states.
So that's...
And would threaten Poland.
From a territorial point of view, you began this question, answering this question by saying, you know, the UK is like public enemy. Number one, would that be more of a grey zone attack then? That would be the talk of like critical national infrastructure, cyber hacking.
I think we're already seeing that.
Yeah.
Russia thinks it's at war with the West already, and it wages war up and down the spectrum. And so all of the things that we've seen over the last few years, whether it's the poisonings in Salisbury, whether it's attempted assassinations in Europe, whether it's cyber attacks, whether it's wrecking and potentially cutting, undersea infrastructure, all of that will happen. Interfering with our democratic processes, all of that happens all of the time. That will continue to happen and could get more serious. Physical attacks on the UK, well, we were talking about it earlier on. If we find ourselves engaged in defending an ally against Article 5, then you could easily see direct attacks on the UK, and with modern weaponry and hypersonic missiles, the flight time is minutes.
I know this is getting into the speculative hypotheticals now, but where is a target? Is it military bases or is it Parliament? Like, what actually does this look like? And I think that this question is important because that is why people are sleepwalking and saying that we aren't a threat, that war isn't a real possibility, because people really can't envision it. If I talk to my friends that aren't journalists or aren't in the military, just ordinary civilians, they just think it's ludicrous, the prospect of actually being engaged in war, that the UK could be attacked.
So let's take that scenario where the Russians, within 5 years, decide that in order to test NATO and test NATO's will and try and break NATO, it goes for a limited incursion. You've got British troops involved on day one. Mm-hmm. So the British are fighting Russians, we're taking casualties and we're causing Russian casualties. We're not going to abandon those troops who are forward. We're going to need to reinforce them. We're going to need to resupply them. So the Russians will do everything they can to break our national will and to make it hard for us to resupply and to reinforce. So they'll go after airfields, certainly military ones, but possibly civilian. They'll go after ports. They'll go after stockpiles where we've got ammunition bunkers, where we've got equipment piled up. Then they remove our ability to go and reinforce and to fight. They go after the Channel Tunnel. Once you are at war, a war that would have been started by the Russians and where we're defending an ally and we're fighting for our own lives, then all of these become military targets, and it can escalate very quickly.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and in those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest newsletter. Each week, Dom Nichols and Francis Durnley answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights. Plus, maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the description to this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each day on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Durnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.